Good evening. Welcome to Expat Insights. I'm your host Raju Mandhyan. Here at Expat Insights, we take external views of internal successes by foreigners, expats, and immigrants who have made Philippines their home. Tonight, we are very blessed and very lucky to have a guest who is a giant amongst the expats in the Philippines. He has been in the country since 1994. He came in here with CIDI, which is the Canadian. He came here for ADB, and then now he's currently the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. English by birth, Canadian by citizenship. Our guest tonight, Mr. Julian Payne, and he's here to talk to us about what the future holds for the Philippines from a Canadian's perspective. So, Mr. Payne, Julian, welcome to Expat Insights.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'll say yes, British by birth, Canadian by citizenship, Philippine by home now.
Philippine by home and heart, that's correct,
yeah. Retirement program.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've immigrated to your country.
Yeah.
And that's where I now live.
Well, I wish it was my country 100%, but yes, I've also made it my home. Yeah.
So I've contributed to the population explosion by adding myself, my wife, and my stepson.
And these are all Canadians, though?
These are all Canadians, but my stepson has married a Filipina, and so we have a grandchild here.
Wow. So how old is the grandchild?
2 years old.
So he doesn't call you Lolo yet?
No, not yet. Everybody calls me Julian anyway.
So correct me on what brought you to the Philippines. A while ago, I was a bit confused whether it was ADB or CIDI that brought you.
No, I worked for many years in the Canadian International Development Agency.
Yes, sir.
That's like USAID. I ended up being the vice president for the Asia program, so I came here many times to Asia. And in fact, I came to the Philippines first in 1988, and then again, I think it was in 1993. But in 1994, I was elected to be the executive director at the Asian Development Bank, who represented Canada, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And that's usually a 4-year posting, and I came here with the expectation of having a pleasant 4 years working at the bank and then going on either back to Canada or to other things. Well, the story changed. First of all, they extended me by 1 year, so I stayed here 5 years. And then they extended me by another year, so I stayed here 6.
This is ADB?
This is the Canadian government.
CIDI, yeah.
The government. And that went on and on until I'd been here 9 years. Well, when I came here, I didn't expect to stay here, didn't even think about staying here. But as time went on, I began to appreciate that this was quite a nice life, and I liked the Philippines. So when they asked me to come back to Canada after I'd been here 9 years, I thought about it very briefly and said, well, I'm getting close to retirement age. I was 63 at the time. I think I'll just retire from the Canadian government, and I'll set up my own private business, and I'll stay living in Southeast Asia.
Which is this.
And we decided, my wife and I, that the Philippines was the most appropriate and pleasant place to stay in Southeast Asia.
Question. Most guests that come here and ask them what really keeps you here. What is the most exciting thing or the most fun thing for you in the Philippines? And most all of them end up saying the people.
That is true. Filipinos are, unless you insult their family, of course, very easy to get along with. They're not confrontational. They speak English. But above all, despite sometimes adverse circumstances, they generally seem to be reasonably fatalistic and happy.
Yeah,
and that's a very precious asset for people to have.
Right, and not just Asians, but people all across the world.
Yes.
No?
There are other reasons why people stay here. I mean, some people like the snow and they like skiing, and some people like the cold. I happen not to particularly like the cold. I used to ski, but now I'm quite happy to live in a tropical climate.
Yeah, and you're not quite of a beach person.
No.
Yeah.
And I don't usually wear a tie. I notice you're wearing a tie.
Oh, okay.
But I am not wearing a tie,
to.
and I generally try not to wear a tie.
Well, the station demands that every host wear a necktie, even though it's burning outside. So today, what keeps you busy in the Philippines, Julian? What is it that you're actively involved in, and whatever value you're adding to the country? What is that you're especially?
Well, I'm not sure what value I add, but I do know I'm kept busy.
Yes, sir.
Which are two different things.
All right.
First of all, I am the elected president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce here, which is a volunteer position.
Yeah.
I've been a trustee, a governor for many, many years. I've been president since October 2009.
Yeah.
That probably takes about a third of my time.
Yeah.
We chair the board of directors and so on. I can come back to that because that involves a lot of representational work with respect to, say, mining or agribusiness, and
right.
other issues that affect Canada, Philippines business
relationships.
interests. So that takes probably a third of my time. I have my own company. It's an international consulting firm that's rather specialist that helps companies, NGOs, even international organizations that don't have offices here do business, particularly with the Asian Development Bank.
Oh,
and
really?
I can talk about
really?
that.
Yeah.
So I do that. The other third of the time, it's a strange mixture. Golf, I play. I try and fix up my condo. I teach in the evening.
Oh, really? Where is that?
I teach at a course that's given by the University of London, London School of Economics, where I attended, which is managed by a local organization, and it's a graduate course in corporate social responsibility. So I do that one night a week.
So is there a name, a place, an institute?
It's International Academy for Economics and Management Studies.
Or the one in Metropolitan Avenue of Mr. Noli Santos.
And then there's a side branch of that called, I think it's something Foreign Studies, and they've contracted with the University of London. And what they do is they hire lecturers like myself, and we're the professors, and we do the teaching, and then the university writes the examination, sets the examination, and marks it. This allows Filipinos to actually get a University of London degree here in the Philippines. And I had 4 graduate students. 2 of them were mid-career, and 2 of them were relatively recent graduates.
Julian, tonight here on this show today, the reason you're here to share with us is how do you see the growth of the Philippines? What does the future hold for the Philippines, seeing that you've lived such a colorful and engaging life? So give us a big picture. We are about to take a break in 1 minute. So give us a big picture as where are we going as a country and how does the horizon look like?
Well, my perspective on the Philippines goes back to '88 when I first came here as a CEDA official for a short visit. And then
this was a CIDI?
CIDA, yes. CEDA. But then it really started in 1994. So I was here in the 1997 financial crisis.
Right, the Asian crisis,
And then I've been here ever since. I think the future of the Philippines, if you make some key assumptions, is looking bright. I think it's begun to turn a corner. I think there are still some big challenges confronting it. But basically, it's being swept along by some of its own strengths.
Innate strengths,
But it's also being swept along by the current of East and Southeast Asia.
Growth,
So there's 2 things that are propelling the Philippines.
All right, sir. Let's take a break. So we'll come back and talk to you about those assumptions and the challenges for the brighter future that is ahead of us. So stay with us. We are with the President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Julian Payne, and we are talking about what the future holds for the Philippines. I'm your host, Raju. This is Expat Insights. Stay watching. Good evening. Welcome back to Expat Insights. I'm your host, Raju Mandhyan. We are with our guest, Mr. Julian Payne of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and we are talking about what the future holds for the Philippines. And just before the break, he said that taking into some assumptions, the future looks bright. So the question I want to ask you, Julian, is what are these assumptions that we are making or should make to a brighter future?
Well, I think that the first one is there's certain key major problems you have to address in the country. And one is you do have a serious poverty problem that's a bit of a drag, and it has to be addressed. That's related to population growth, which is a very sensitive issue here. But the fact is, if you have a high population growth, you have to have a higher growth rate to in a sense,
to balance it.
So that raises one issue. The second issue is corruption. This is not unique to the Philippines, I may say. This is fairly widespread, so I don't think
so
the
a lot
Philippines
of developing
should feel,
countries,
and even in some developed countries, I may say. The present administration is addressing that. The Makati Business Club and the European Chamber of Commerce have launched this integrity initiative.
Arrancada.
And that's being signed up by a lot of private sector companies, basically pledging not to be corrupt. Some countries, like the United States and Canada, have very tough anti-corruption laws that apply to their companies when they're operating overseas. It's a huge problem, corruption every place, and it happens both at the working level, where people are just trying to make a few extra pesos to feed their families, to at the most senior levels, where people are trying to make a fortune. And I think the problem is one has to change the attitude towards it, because corruption basically skims off a lot of the potential of economic growth.
Of the energy.
And the growth. And also it undermines competitivity. I mean, if there's corrupt practices taking place, you don't have a competitive environment, and therefore you don't get the best value for money. I mean, quite apart from the moral aspects. The economic aspects of corruption are very, very serious.
You just look at it from a logical point of view. Question, Julian, before you go any further. You mentioned that corruption exists for two reasons. Number one, for people who need to survive, and people who feed their greed. My bias, of course, lies towards people who need to survive. Those are the administrators on the streets. You know, the people who do hands-on. How do we, are there any recommendations coming from Arrancada towards that first? Because the greed can be handled much later if the people on the street are fed well. Has Arrancada ever thought of that?
I once had somebody tell me it wasn't related to the Philippines, it was related to another country in Asia. That if you have a policeman who has a family and has a reasonable expectation of living, and his salary is below what can fund, you can assume that man is on the take.
Well, he'll have to survive, he'll have to live.
So I think a key thing in corruption is to ensure that people have employment and have a reasonable wage. That's one thing. The second thing is education. People need to realize that corruption does undermine basically the economy, basically the morals of society, and in the end it will end up with a worse society.
So that player on the street needs to understand and see the big picture. So the education is part of that process.
But it's a widespread problem. If you're living in a barangay or barrio someplace, and you're squeaky clean, but all your neighbors are not, so you're going to wonder why
am I doing right?
That's right. No, I don't think, my own view is that it's the top that sets the tone, and if you have corruption at the senior levels and at in the private sector as well as in the government, then why shouldn't the poor people be corrupt? Why shouldn't they? If people who have money can be corrupt, why shouldn't I, who don't have money? So it's a big problem, but it's not just a Philippine problem. People should not think that this is a thing just in the Philippines, which we should be embarrassed about it, but it's every place. And it takes two to corrupt, it takes two to dance. And the firms and the individuals who are paying are just as at fault as those who are receiving.
So that's one assumption. Poverty and corruption, they go hand in hand. They're actually two sides of one coin. What are the other things that we need to
The second is your competitivity. Competitiveness, The world is a very, very competitive place. And with the globalization and with the internet, people have choices. They have choices which product they want from China, from the Philippines, from Thailand. They have problems which beach they want to go to. Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia. So everything is very competitive. And one of the things one has to do is remain competitive. And competitive means price and quality. And that relates a bit to corruption. If you have corruption, you add a layer of expenditure. You become less competitive. That is another problem of corruption. So in the Philippines, you have, for example, you have wonderful beaches. I can talk about some in a moment. You have wonderful places for tourists to go in the mountains. But if you don't have an airline that flies directly from Europe to here, people are going to go to a place where there is one that goes directly from Europe, like Thailand. In Canada, we're very fortunate. We have an airline that flies directly from
Ball does,
Manila to Vancouver
Mm-hmm.
on the way to Las Vegas. So we have that.
Yeah.
But that helps competitively.
Yeah.
The second thing, in your beaches and hotels, you can have beautiful beaches, but unless you have competitively priced hotels with the same
Service,
quality of
yeah,
service,
yeah.
people will go to Thailand or Vietnam. So a huge problem in the Philippines is being competitive. Now you have a National Competitive Council headed by Bill Luce,
Yes,
who's
sir.
doing a fantastic job.
Yeah.
And he is focusing on the really key areas. I mean, you can get lost in this issue and address 1,000 things and do
it's like
nothing.
running a big business.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he's focusing on the real areas where we need improvement.
Which might they be?
Well, one is
Bills,
governance
bills.
and corruption. One is the cost of doing business.
Correct.
In many
So
cases...
utilities and power and bureaucracy and red tape.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
and,
one.
And we have somewhere to get a business license, it'll take 20 steps. But others, like the Philippines Retirement Authority, where to get an SRRB, very efficient.
Smooth.
That is probably one of the most competitive retirement programs in Southeast Asia, both in terms of what you value for money and getting a bit of paper.
So thus you're implying that what is working for PRA, the Philippine Retirement Authority, the way they are structured, the way they process can be applied to every other department of the Philippines. Business registration, taxation, immigration, yeah?
I've worked 35 years as a bureaucrat in Canada. So
Right.
I know how government works inside, and there's a lot of similarities wherever you are.
Yeah.
If it takes 7 steps to do things as opposed to 2, the chances are, 1, it's going to take longer. 2, it's going to take the person who's trying to get the decision more time. Time is money, so it costs more.
Yeah.
And 3, if you have 7 steps, you have 7 opportunities for corruption. If you have 2, you have 2. So
Plus
if you can
yeah.
simplify the number of steps in business,
Yeah.
you will improve your competitiveness, you will reduce the potential for corruption, and you will reduce the costs.
I haven't registered or started any business in several years, no? But from what I remember, BOI and DTI used to work hand in hand, and there was this one-stop action center, which was put up years ago. How functional and how successful is that now?
Well, you're talking of the national government,
Yeah.
but there's also municipal governments. Sometimes you have to
right,
get licenses. I mean, you
Yeah,
cannot
yeah,
just
yeah.
look at one. You have to look at the whole picture.
Correct,
And the
correct,
fact
correct.
is that people find it rather tedious and bureaucratic.
Right, right,
Now,
right.
I think the government is trying to address that. And it has to, but you ask, what are the challenges? Okay? We went through poverty, we went through corruption. We're now talking about business processes.
Yeah, okay.
Let me talk about another one. And this is one where there's been a recent welcome announcement. It's education.
Right.
Your country, your people, are blessed by being able to speak English and with an accent that is really lovely and understandable, unlike some people.
Very universal.
Yes.
Yeah.
However, your education system was basically K+10. So your high school graduates were not competitive with those who came from other systems with K+12. Well, the government is now changing that.
Yeah.
That's a big step towards intellectual competitivity.
Okay.
So that's another step. Now, nothing happens overnight.
Yeah.
But these are major steps that are happening.
And is the expat community, including the Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce and the people with the Arrancada initiative, are they hand in hand, and do they trust that this current administration will successfully, if not complete it, at least launch it correctly? Are we hand in hand?
Well, I won't speak. I'll just speak for myself and the Canadian.
Yeah.
There's no question that the government seems to, and the administration
Bent on doing it right.
is bent on trying to address corruption.
Right.
The question is, I think a lot of it in people's minds is, can you only focus on that? A president has only 6 years,
Correct.
and there are other things to address too. Well, they are. They're addressing education. We've seen the K+12.
Which is really
which is
fun,
good.
yeah.
I think there's a growing confidence
Yeah.
in the Philippines, but of course the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you see what is being said, and on the other hand, you see, well, there's certain things that are happening, you wonder. We can talk about mining in a few moments, if you wish.
Right after this,
Yes.
yeah, you can tell us about it. So are you done?
Yes.
Are you done? So you're not saying anything further beyond the performance of
I will say the government is moving ahead.
They're bent to doing it
in the right direction. It's got a long way to go.
But let's not measure it yet. That's what you're saying. Okay. So let's bring you to that issue right now, because you have been quite active with the discussions that are happening on mining, and it's a little bit of abrasive an issue. But give us a big picture on it. What are the pros or cons, if any, of mining, Julian?
Well, first of all, I come from a mining country. The Canadian economy was built on natural resources, including mining and agriculture and so on. So we are quite familiar with the problems and the benefits.
Okay.
But I notice you're wearing a watch. If we have no mining, throw away your watch. Nobody's going to have a watch. Throw away your car. Throw away your cell phone. In fact, this building probably has steel inside it to hold it up.
Okay.
So you've got to have mining someplace.
You've got to have minerals, you're saying.
Got
You've got
to
to have
minerals,
metal, okay.
Yes, and to have minerals, you have to get mining, because minerals happen to be in the ground. So I think the issue is not whether there should be mining or not. That's a false issue. Okay. The issue is, how do you have environmentally and socially responsible mining that allows the investment a return to make it worthwhile? It's a huge problem.
And that doesn't harm the ecosystem.
Yes, that's what I say, environmentally sustainable.
Yeah.
And so you have environmental sustainability, you have social, and you have the indigenous people. But you also have, mining is a high-risk endeavor, not just in terms of a possible disaster, but also in terms of investing a lot of money and not getting any money back, because you suddenly think there's going to be a mine and there isn't.
You dug up a mountain and spent $100 million. And
so it's a high-risk financial as well as economic, and it has to be managed very carefully. And we have to be able to satisfy the environmental protection needs, the social protection needs, and an adequate return for investors. Now, the government, I think, particularly in recent days, has started to focus on where the middle ground is. And we support that. If you look at Canada and Australia, I mean, if you look in the past, we've had our own disasters. But by and large now, large-scale miners are quite heavily regulated and are socially and environmentally responsible. They are. It's the unregulated mining, the illegal mining, that actually is causing the problem of landslides and so on.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you regulate to ensure adequate protection without making it uncompetitive? Because investors will go to Chile, they'll go to Canada, they'll go to Australia. There's lots of places to mine.
So, I'm looking at it, your approach is pro-mining, and that's fine, because it
No,
makes
my approach is pro-socially and environmentally responsible mining.
Okay, let's expand on that. No? So what steps do we take? I know there was a little discussion a couple of days ago, and you're not privy to discussing the details of that. But big picture, what does the common man out on the streets in Palawan or Marinduque need to understand? And he shouldn't rally on the streets against mining. What does he need to understand that we are doing right?
You have a mining law.
Yes.
That actually is considered one of the better, if not one, mining laws in the world.
On paper?
On paper.
Okay.
The issue is not the mining law. The issue is the implementation and enforcement of the law.
Okay.
The second problem is you have large-scale mining and you have small-scale mining. And frankly, if either are environmentally negligent, you have a disaster. So you have to regulate both. You cannot just regulate one and not the other.
Sorry, these two are?
Large-scale mining.
And the ones that
and then you have the small-scale mining. The small scale. So that's important, that when you have an approach to mining, that it's comprehensive. It's got to be comprehensive to cover all size operations environmentally.
Yeah.
It's got to be comprehensive to cover all size operations socially.
Right.
And frankly, if the government wants its fair share of return on mining, it's got to cover all sections in terms of getting taxes back on all sections, not just the large-scale miners.
So would it be pragmatic for the big-scale miners or the regulated ones to partake of this implementation with the government, rather than just depending on the government saying that, hey, you guys look after it, we'll come and dig? why don't we, the bigger guys, invest in it? Invest in the implementation of the law?
Well, they do. They comply with the law. And by and large, you'll see the big-scale miners not only comply with the law, they actually, I mentioned I taught corporate social responsibility.
Yes, sir.
A lot of the miners actually do a lot more in terms of building local roads, local schools, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in Mindanao. So they do. But the problem is that mining is difficult, and you have to persuade people that their environmental and social interests are being
Addressed.
protected
Yeah.
and protected.
During the break, Julian, you mentioned a 1994 incident, and you said you wanted to shed some light on what really occurred in Marinduque. I have no idea of what happened in 1994 in Marinduque. So would you, we have 2 minutes to close, would you want to give us a story of what happened?
In Marinduque, there was a very unfortunate break in an internal dam in the drainage of the mountain that let the tailings and the nasty effluent flow into the river and had a very, very disastrous impact.
They were mining for what at that time?
I think it was copper.
Right.
Mar Copper was the local company.
Yeah.
So that was a case where there was a disaster.
Right, sir.
Whether it was at fault of the construction or a natural disaster, it's not entirely clear. But the really interesting thing is what happened after that.
Yeah.
The Canadian company involved was Placidome. At the time, it's no longer, it's been bought out by another company. They called me. And
you were with the ADB that time?
I was the executive director. They called me. I was in Vancouver at the time. They called me and said, Julian, we've had this situation. Just be aware of it. So I was following it fairly closely. Placidome actually moved very quickly, and people say they walked out on it. That, I don't think, is factually true. My understanding is they provided between $20 and $90 million worth of
support,
assistance to rectify the damage. The question is whether they provided the money. The question is, was the money well used, and where did it go? Which is an interesting question.
So we leave it at that, yeah? And that's for the authorities to figure out. Let's take a break now. We'll come back and talk to you about what the future holds for Filipinos in Canada and what the Canadian Chamber is doing to support this bilateral movement of people.
Yes.
Yeah? So ladies and gentlemen, we are with Julian Payne, and we just finished talking about mining and tourism, and we'll come and talk about what the future holds for Filipinos in Canada with the President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm your host, Raju. Mandhyan. Stay watching. Good evening. Welcome back to Expert Insights. I'm your host, Raju Mandhyan, and we are talking to Mr. Julian Payne of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and we are talking about what the future holds for the Philippines. We've just finished discussing mining, tourism, and education in the Philippines. Let's talk to Julian about what Filipinos are doing in Canada and where the potentials lie. So, Julian, tell us about the 500,000 Filipinos in Canada, or less, I think, a little bit.
Yes,
yeah.
I think it's...
Yeah.
First of all, just as background, I was an immigrant to Canada.
Right, right.
12 years old, and I went by ship. You didn't go by plane then, you went by ship.
Those are the good old days.
It took 7 days. Some countries like Canada depend on immigration. Our birth rate is quite low.
Right.
We need a slowly expanding population, so we welcome immigrants. One of the interesting challenges in immigration is how are they accepted and how do they impact on the existing society.
Right.
In some countries, in Europe, there's been some major problems with immigration, with groups that have come in and they haven't adjusted to the local culture and vice versa. So, and I won't comment on that.
Yeah.
In Canada, we generally have had a policy going back to the 60s of multiculturalism, where we welcome and encourage, within the framework of the law, diverse cultures.
Right.
So we have a policy in Canada that is strongly supportive of that. That started in the 60s. The Filipinos started coming to Canada to Winnipeg. They came as garment workers. And they adapted quite well, and like in many cases, they started bringing their relatives and so on.
Yeah.
So now we have a situation where the Philippines are, I think, the largest number of immigrants per year from any country
Wow.
that come to Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have to ask why. Well, I think there's
Why?
several reasons. One of the general requirements that seems to count for being accepted as a resident and immigrant is to speak one of Canada's official languages, English
French
or French.
or English, yeah.
Well, you can see that Filipinos generally have they've got
they got an edge.
They've got an edge there.
Yeah.
Secondly, Filipinos basically, when they come to Canada, are known to be hardworking.
Yes.
Thirdly, they are not known to form
Disturb
gangs or cults or things like that. They fit comfortably into society, and generally they are seen as very law-abiding citizens, including paying taxes and things like that.
Very nice.
So they're generally perceived as a very good immigrant, and they're welcome. Increasingly, it used to be that they were primarily garment workers or care workers.
Blue-collar work.
But now you're seeing more and more sort of higher grade, more skilled professions. And this is where we talked about K+12. That will have an impact in the end.
The change in the education.
So the bottom line is that there's a growing number of immigrants. I'm not talking about AFWs at this point. Immigrants. And that they are very welcomed, and they seem to adjust well to Canadian society.
What does it take, besides knowing English and being a professional? Does it take any monetary investment to settle down?
There is you'd have to speak to the embassy for the details. There is an investment program where you can actually, if you're going to invest, get a visa. But that's not the main program. The main program is actually, one, do you have skills which are in short demand? And that varies in different countries, different provinces in Canada. For example, when oil prices are high, the expansion of the tar sands in northern Canada is a huge growth area of jobs. They just don't need oil riggers.
Workers,
They need somebody to flip the hamburgers in McDonald's.
Right.
And so
or
you need
to run
people,
the church or the school or the market.
So people need to be attracted to go to those places. Well, Filipinos, you see, they're very prepared to go.
So there's still a lot of potential, and there'll always be in the coming years that Filipinos can go and make Canada the home.
And
what about the Canadians in this country? There are 7,500 Canadians. I'm not calling you a Canadian because you're part English.
I am a Canadian.
Okay.
I am a Canadian.
All right. So the 7,000.
My wife is a Canadian.
Okay.
And my son is a Canadian.
All right.
Please.
Okay. Sorry about that. So what are we doing here? What are the Canadians doing? What keeps them busy?
Well, first of all, it's a little difficult, frankly, to say how many Canadians are here, because a lot of Filipinos...
The website says 7,500.
No. A lot of Filipinos have Canadian citizenship.
So the brown Canadians.
That's an interesting issue in its own right.
Right.
And true of others. So
how many members in the Chamber of Commerce then?
We have about 250 companies and individual members.
These are true blue Anglo-Saxon Canadians?
No. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce is wide open. If you have a business interest in Canada, you're welcome. You want an application form? I'm happy to give you one.
Oh, not right now. Okay. Yeah.
No, but seriously, we have Philippine companies and we have Canadian companies. We have Philippine individuals and we have Canadian individuals.
Okay.
All you have to do is have an interest in Canada-Philippines business. So that 251 isn't all Canadian.
Right. So, well, what is the most popular business? What are the Canadians doing here? The Chamber of Commerce, what is their main business?
The big businesses, there's a number of Canadian companies in the BPO call center, TELUS, Transcom, and so on. Although sometimes these companies, it's hard to tell, are they Canadian or are they being bought out by the Americans or what?
We don't know what the...
But TELUS is known as a Canadian company and so on. There are some there's the big life insurance companies, Sun Life, Manulife. There are certain mining companies, TVI and so on. There's a number of smaller consultants and so on. I
recently attended a little executive development program run by Sean Georgette.
Yes.
So what are the other activities that the Canadian Chamber does and Filipino community can partake of?
We have our main program in Manila, and we started a year and a half ago a chapter in Cebu, and I'm hoping we will start one in Davao. The activities of the Canadian Chamber actually fall into three different groups. We do business services like the briefing you attended.
Yeah.
Basically, we offer specialized business briefings and information to members.
Right.
The second thing is we do advocacy work. For example, in the mining sector, we will go and try and ensure that Canadian interests are taken into account by the government.
Right.
The third thing we do is we have quite a number of events which are business networking events. On our National Day, Christmas Day, once a month, where business people with an interest can
come and
talk to each other. Yeah. The other thing we do is we do provide a service if a new Canadian company wants to explore what's happening in the Philippines and whether we will give them a briefing and try and help them.
Right, so that's one-on-one.
Yes.
That's one-on-one. Okay, Julian, thank you very much for sharing your insights on what the future holds for the Philippines. And I'm done asking you about what the future holds for the Philippines. Is there anything I had missed asking you and you still want to share?
Oh, I think lots of things, but I think you covered some of the more interesting ones.
Okay, so let me then ask you, what does the future hold for Julian Payne?
Well, I live here. I expect to stay here for as long as I live.
Yeah.
I believe in being active and doing things, so I don't see myself lying on a beach.
Right.
At some point, they'll decide to elect a new president, I hope, of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Just doing interesting things.
So, say 10, 20, 30 years down the line, when the Canadian Filipino community turns around and says, oh, that was Julian Payne back in 2012. What good did he do? What would that be?
I suppose be a good immigrant to your country.
Just a good person.
Just like Filipinos are good immigrants to Canada.
All right, sir. Thank you very much for being on this show.
Salamat po.
One more. What is the most favorite place that you like in the Philippines? If you're not a beach person, but if one was to holiday here, what would you recommend?
Well, I'm not a beach person, but I did recently go up to the province of Aurora.
Okay.
And I went north from Balaire, which is the capital. This was a business trip. I was not going to a beach.
Right.
And I saw north of Balaire, about 2/3 the way to Casiguran, the most beautiful beach I think I've ever seen.
Better than Boracay.
Well, I haven't been to Boracay because I'm not a beach person.
All right.
But the beach was it must be about 10 or 15 kilometers long, curved, with mountains behind it, and the Pacific Ocean stretching all the way to Canada in front of it.
Right, right.
It was really beautiful, and there was not a soul on it.
How about lodging and boating there?
We drove on. When we drove by it, there were some small little cottages and things like that. I did not see any mega hotels.
I'm going to go check this place out.
You should.
I'm going to go.
It's about 6 hours, 7 hours.
Salamat, and you have 30 seconds to say hello and bye-bye to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce if they're watching.
Well, all members of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we had our annual meeting. We appreciated it. We welcome your support, and we look forward to you continuing to support the Canadian Chamber. Thank you. Salamat po.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much for watching Expert Insights. I'm your host, Raju Mandhyan. That was Julian Payne from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And next week, we'll see you with the Ambassador of New Zealand. Good night and have a great week ahead of you. Mabuhay. Thank you so much for listening.